Mario también, ¿verdad?
El doctor Mario, sí.
También hay que destacar. Entonces, si gustan, ya podemos arrancar, ¿eh?
Muy bien. Tenemos 4 minutos, ¿verdad, Mónica?
Si quieres, esperamos un minutito más y
Sí.
arrancamos porque ya están transmitiendo, ¿verdad?
Yes.
Inicio en un minutito. Buenas tardes, sean dadas a todos ustedes. Agradecemos su presencia nuevamente en este tercer Encuentro Norte-Sur Global, CISAN-UNAM, que hemos iniciado desde ayer actividades. Entonces, en esta ocasión hemos titulado este tercer encuentro Turbulencias financieras y política económica en la pandemia, desafíos para la integración, el cambio estructural y el desarrollo norte-sur. Este encuentro está siendo organizado, patrocinado por los proyectos PAPIIT IN 30-2020 y el proyecto IA 309-20. Agradecemos a la DEGAPA por todo el apoyo y también queremos agradecer por las dos instituciones que están siendo co-host en este evento, el CISAN y el JEC, aquí en nuestra casa de estudios, la UNAM. Aunque sea virtual, damos las gracias a todo el soporte que nos han dado nuestras autoridades para la realización de este evento y también a nombre de la doctora Mónica Meireles y su servidora, pues podemos dar lugar a esta segunda mesa magistral que tenemos un gran honor de tener con nosotros al doctor Mario Seccareccia y como comentarista al doctor Wesley Marshall. Voy a leer un poco, una semblanza muy cortita de ambos y después daré unas palabras en inglés de bienvenida al doctor Seccareccia. El doctor Seccareccia es profesor de tiempo completo de la Facultad de Economía de Ciencias Sociales de la Universidad de Ottawa, en Canadá. Es autor y coautor y editor de una docena de libros y monografías y más de 40 números especiales de revistas y ha publicado más de 100 artículos de libros. También es editor del International Journal of Political Economy, publicado por Taylor and Francis. Sus principales intereses de investigación se encuentran en el área de economía monetaria y macroeconomía, historia del pensamiento y metodología económica laboral e historia económica canadiense. Ha dictado conferencias en el Post-Keynesian Summer School de la Universidad de Missouri en Kansas City y los seminarios Minsky en el Board College en Estados Unidos. Bienvenido, doctor. También tenemos al doctor Wesley Marshall, que en esta tarde será el comentarista de nuestra conferencia magistral, y él es titular de tiempo completo en la UAM Ixtapalapa, del Departamento de Economía en el área de Economía Política. Participa en la línea de conocimiento de Economía Social de la maestría y el doctorado de Estudios Sociales, con orientación temática al desarrollo económico-social y en economía financiera. El doctor Marshall obtuvo su doctorado por la Universidad Autónoma de México y es miembro del Sistema Nacional de Investigadores nivel 2. Bienvenido también en esta tarde. We are very honored to have in this afternoon Dr. Mario Seccareccia. We know you are very busy and you have made a time in your schedule to be with us this afternoon. We really are honored to have you here. This is a conference with young scholars, so we really want to welcome, and we hope to learn a lot as always, and we thank your availability for being with us this afternoon. You have the word, and take your time. You have 50 minutes for your participation. Thank you very much, Dr. Seccareccia.
Muchas gracias, compañera Claudia. You know, truly I'm honored to be here, and I apologize that I cannot be there with you physically.
Oh, well,
really.
We also sorry for that.
No, honestly, and I must say something, not only, it's a special thanks to you in particular, because, you know, you spoke to me about this conference about 1.5 years ago, if not more. I can't remember. I think it was in January, February, or somewhere there in 2019. I was about to say 1919. I might as well, you know, with the pandemic here, another one. But I must say that so it's been a long while, and I was supposed to come to in May, actually. And everything, obviously, as we know, was canceled. And we shifted it forward to November. And I was still looking forward to that. But needless to say, you know, here we are in a kind of cyberspace instead. So I regret that. But at the same time, I'm extremely happy to be here. Now, what I would like to do is to start by sharing the screen, if I can. And because I did prepare a PowerPoint here. So I'll see host disabled. Okay, well, you're gonna have to enable me to share it.
Please, Monica, can you help me with that? Or
because it's saying host disabled participant screen sharing.
José Carlos, por favor, ¿nos puedes apoyar?
It's still
José Carlos, por favor.
¿Podrías habilitar la pantalla del doctor Seccareccia, por favor, José Carlos?
Yeah, it's still not.
Just give us a minute, please. And nice to see you. Thank you very much. I think now it's okay to go ahead.
Okay. Oh yes, good, perfect. Yes. Okay, good. Let me just sort of put this here. Where is it? Okay. Okay. Could you see that now? Okay. Great. Well, actually, you will notice something. I slightly modified the title. I removed the S from pandemic because, I mean, it's a worldwide pandemic and we're part of it. But that's, yeah. But, and also changed not for chauvinistic reasons here. I put Canada first there, like as Donald Trump did with the, with the new NAFTA thing there. But rather because I'm going to be talking more about Canada than Mexico, and it would be a bit of a misnomer to highlight it the other way. But otherwise, it's going to be covering, in fact, the 3 countries a little bit, and then we'll get mostly to Canada, which I know most about, and perhaps you would be most interested in as well, because I think it's an interesting example of what's been going on in terms of dealing with the pandemic, and I will highlight some of the major policy changes going on, Okay, let me, so what is the object of this? Actually, just realize it here. I may have to Well, I'm just sort of being cut off a little bit from the thing, but in any case, I'll do it. I'll try to make sense of what I'm just, because I have a problem with my view here. Okay, well, as it indicated there, the goal of this presentation is really to offer a kind of broad view here, bird's eye view, of how the pandemic impacted economically, in this case, the three countries here of North America. But I will address the question of whether the type of macroeconomic policies that were implemented in response to the pandemic, to the crisis, mattered in terms of what I would like to argue is the ultimate goal, which must be to protect, of course, the welfare, if you wish, of its people, whether it be in terms of income support, okay, and most importantly, of course, also in minimizing, obviously, the loss of life in the process. And it's on that basis that we're going to try to see how this has worked itself out. Now, I'm going to, just 2 days ago, I pulled out this data from one site that I've been actually looking at for months, because it's the one that's even more up to date, I find, every day than the World Health Organization one. I'm not sure which one is more believable. Normally, the data that they did provide is similar to what we hear here, let's say, with regards to Canada in particular. But I do want to, I just pulled out the three countries. Okay, and it's the data is somewhat bizarre, but I think I could explain it. Just take note of the fact that what I did is simply classify the three countries in terms of, one, cases per 1,000 of COVID, and secondly, of course, the number of deaths per 1,000, with regards to COVID again. And if you look at it, what's striking, I mean, there are a number of things now. There are obvious, and I would call glaring problems with these figures. Okay? If looked at from the angle of the spread of the disease within the population since last winter, spring, it would seem that Canada and Mexico are very similar, with about 8 recorded cases per 1,000 inhabitants, and with the US being an outlier here, with over 4 times that rate, okay? Now, however, if looked at from the angle of the number of deaths per capita arising from the pandemic, Mexico and the US are very similar. They have almost identical mortality rates of, which while Canada has about 1/3 that, in terms of death rate per 1,000 than its southern neighbors. Now, these numbers would seem rather puzzling on the one hand, because of course, there would be apart from the fact that the numbers must, especially with the cases, actually reflect merely a tip of the iceberg for all the three countries, I would argue. There are, I would think, also huge institutional differences when it comes to their respective healthcare systems, which have impacted on individual behavior differently in each country. And these include both the physical capacity of the healthcare system, the financial cost per person, and the proportion of the population that is medically insured. I should also mention that the way in which these tests are done, they're not random, obviously, but needless to say, the rigor and the amounts through which this is done, or the intensity through which this is done, differ a great deal across these countries. And perhaps the reason why, let's say in the case of Mexico, it seems so much, it's even slightly lower than Canada's in terms of number of cases, is a bit of I would think it's a bit of an aberration here. It's simply reflecting the fact that they're just doing less testing. The real, I think, the more obvious one that I think reveals a little bit better the real situation here are the number of deaths here, because they tend to be more efficiently categorized as such. And even that, perhaps there could be errors and so on, but needless to say, less so than the number of cases that are, as I said, it's the tip of the iceberg. And depending on how deep that tip is there with regards to each country, you will get different results here. But what is clear is that at least with regards to the death rate, Canada has been doing a lot better on average in terms of the number involved here. And now, for what reasons is the issue here? And I would like to argue that it's not independent on the type of macroeconomic policies that were pursued, okay, during this whole period. They are not independent of that. Now, needless to say, there are also obvious structural differences. You know, I mean, it's obvious that we have a healthcare system that is universal. There are a lot of differences that we compare, let's say, to Mexico or the United States. But what is clear here is that surely with regards to that kind of performance in trying to minimize, let's say, the number of deaths in particular, Canada did a lot better than the other two North American countries. Now, when the World Health Organization declared the pandemic officially last March, our respective countries did implement measures, you know, to contain the spread, you know, starting with, you know, regional kind of lockdowns, travel restrictions, etc. And all of that, depending on the respective, you know, jurisdictions in each country, that happen over the coming weeks, from towards the end of March all the way to April, of course, during April. Now, since the intention was, of course, to contain the actual spread of this disease, what it did is it triggered a collapse of the real economy as production declined in these sectors, especially in the commodity or goods producing sectors where physical distances, you know, cannot be maintained, as well as in a lot of services, including education, of course, as you would know very well, in your case as well, you know, whatever, restaurants, personal services, et cetera, all of these were heavily impacted. And these were, in fact, not only as a result of the actual shrinking of demand and all that resulted from that, as we'll see in a minute, but also, of course, because this was an active policy of the state here to restrict, you know, in this case, the movement and circulation and the contact of individuals. Okay? Now, because of it, actually, what's interesting is that initially, but it's not the case generally, because there was a lot of debate here in Canada in particular about that, whether or not this was what they referred to it as a she session versus a he session in the sense of gender impact of it, because initially it impacted more female employment than it did male. When we look at the incidence of unemployment, for instance, by gender, but not markedly. And in fact, as we're going to see, it not very much in reality, but there was made a big thing initially, but as I would like to argue, it won't be, it's not as important as it turned out, as it did not, in fact, than what they were making it out to be. Now, let me just look at some figures here. I pulled this out of the OECD data, and what's interesting here is that the least affected in terms of overall real GDP growth, and this is something I was a bit surprised because we're going to see what happened to the unemployment rate. The US, the green line there, it in fact was the least affected, then Canada, and then Mexico was the most affected in terms of overall production. Okay. During that whole period. So I have data here from 2018 all the way to the third quarter of 2020. And if you look at the unemployment rate of the three countries in terms of comparison again, okay, what we could see here is that the United States and Canada are similar in terms of the overall, you know, evolution there. The United States kind of peaked a bit higher than Canada, but you know, they're not that far off. And if you look in Mexico, it barely, well, it did budge, but not as much as all that in comparison to the two other countries. Okay. Now, I'll have a lot to say about that in a minute. Also, just to make, remember we're talking about the so-called she session versus he session here of it, yeah? What is interesting here, of course, is that if you look at the data, this is by gender now. If you look at, this is for Canada, you could see here that the unemployment rate of female peaked higher than male, okay, during that initial period. So both kind of jumped out, you know, immediately after the, you know, once the, you know, in the second quarter there, well, first and second quarter jumped up there of 2020, with the female unemployment rate peaking a bit higher than the male, but it's not a big gap there, really, you know, because traditionally, as you could see here, the female unemployment rate here is lower than the male normally in Canada. I'm not sure about Mexico, but this is what we have here. And this has a lot to do with the nature of the industries involved and so on, in which you find women primarily dominating. However, what's interesting is that, of course, once that, you know, once the economy slumped here, the unemployment rate skyrocketed more for female than male initially. Okay, but then it went back down to its normal kind of, you know, spread there, back to where the unemployment rate for male is higher than female. Okay, on average. And also you could see that in terms of participation rates, actually they behave very similar. There isn't much to say there. In fact, whether it's female or male, there was a, you know, there was a significant a slump here. Now it's interesting here that this is important because we have, of course, a policy that was implemented here to get people out of work, and to a large extent here, as a result of the pandemic. And so what we see here is this happening and impacting pretty much across the board here for both male and female. Now, so what we have here basically is that the jump in the unemployment rate was both, I would argue, a kind of endogenous market response to the collapse of demand, you know, for certain goods and services, and especially services here, you know. But also it was a programmed, I would argue, or planned response resulting from government actions to implement the initial lockdown. Okay? Both of these were in fact there. And the incidence of the unemployment rate was at the beginning, as I said, marginally more significant, or, you know, on female workers and male, but other than that, over the 6 months since then, that data changed. You could see here that it didn't really much, it's not important as much as all that. Now, the most striking phenomena among the three countries is that what we find is that the unemployment rate did not recover as quickly in Canada as it did in the United States and Mexico, where even actually in the case of Mexico, it barely fluctuated. Now, there are good reasons why in Mexico it fluctuated, because you also have an informal sector that is very large that tends to absorb it very quickly in comparison, so that in a sense, you could argue that a lot of that is purely institutional, but it's also because there is another element to this, which has to do with the strength of the financial support in terms of social programs in place and so on, as we're going to see in a minute. As a good example, in Canada and both the United States as well, we have the, you know, unemployment insurance, or what we call employment insurance in Canada. But also because in the case of Canada in particular, much more than the United States, there was a whole slew, you know, a whole battery there of special fiscal measures, especially, that were implemented, that would have really put in place here, that led to what I would, you know, what, as we're going to see in a minute, to explosive budget deficits. Now, let me just give you this is in terms of the net lending of the as a percentage of GDP here of these, again, the respective governments. Now, in the case of Canada and Mexico, I have general governments, so it's all of them combined. In the United States, I was only able to get the federal one. Now, it's true that for the state one, they ran balanced budgets normally, so it's not even much of an issue there. But in the case of Canada, no. And we have provincial governments that have been running big deficits as well, as we're going to see in a minute. So the general balance here is much more of interest here. Now, this is as a percentage of GDP. And what we could see here, obviously, we have a dramatic collapse here, okay, of the, well, if you want, of the net surplus going from, with around zero almost here in Canada, as you can see here. This is the blue line. And then it was the one that has the steepest slope here, in a sense, compared to both the United States and Mexico here. Mexico is barely showing a big jump here. I mean, a big decline here, if you wish. But, and this to some extent reflects, how AMLO has been, the government there, your administration has been reacting and responding to the crisis. Okay. But for sure, if you look at the Canadian case, it was the steepest one here. And I think this is perhaps a much more interesting picture for you. Okay. I pulled this out of a study done by one of our banks here that actually categorized it by in this case, by the discretionary and non-discretionary or automatic primary spending, the kind of, what do you want to call it, automatic stabilizers and stuff. And what's interesting, well, actually, of all the G20 countries, needless to say, Canada is kind of first here in terms of the steep, well, as we saw before with the steepness of the decline there, okay, where it reached about 20% of GDP, okay, as compared to the United States, which is less here. And then, of course, Mexico was just second to the last year. And Turkey actually running a discretionary part of their spending that is, in the opposite direction even, which is amazing. Okay? But in the case of Mexico, is close to, as I said, it's very little in comparison. Okay? So you could see it in terms of the actual response here, that Canada was a kind of star here in terms of the amount of spending that was going on here. Okay? And, very strong kind of Keynesian sort of, or whatever you want to call it, your response here to the pandemic. Now, and as I said, most of that also, by the way, just from the figure you could see, most of that was in fact discretionary. We do have a lot of programs that are acting as stabilizers, like employment insurance, but at the same time, the overall proportion of it, as you can see, was discretionary. In other words, the government acted on what happened there and began to make huge changes in their spending policies. Okay? Now, so what were these various policies that were implemented? I'm not going to give you, there's a whole battery of them. I just picked some of the most important ones, actually. Okay? But there was I've indicated for you here the site here that you could look at if you're interested, that gives you a list, in the case of fiscal side, for instance, what they did. There's also the monetary side that is important, as we're going to see in a minute. But now, what they did is, of course, extended, made it was a lot easier starting off, as we do have an unemployment insurance system. And what it did is, of course, is that it made it a lot easier for anybody to get unemployment insurance, absolutely. Okay. But that was a program in place. But then look at all the others that came along here. I'll start with the big one here, which is important because what it did, this is so-called CERB, or the Canada Emergency Response Benefits that were introduced in April, immediately after the pandemic was declared, so to speak. And what it did is that it's almost akin, as some argued, to a kind of UBI, but it wasn't quite that, universal basic income, because what it did is that all those who were not covered by unemployment insurance were in fact receiving an income. So all the self-employed who were affected by the crisis, all were receiving $2,000 per month, period. And it was extremely easy again to get that, and it was, the huge amount spent on that, as we're going to look at the numbers in a minute. Yeah. But what is important, it was, and it affected something like 9 million self-employed. For Canada, this is extremely a significant amount, okay? And as I said, it was akin to something akin to a kind of a universal basic income, in the sense that anybody got that 2,000 pretty much, okay? Also, they introduced what they call the Canada Emergency Wage Subsidy, okay, which basically paid something like to all firms, okay, who were trying to retain their workers, even though they had to lock down, okay? So it affected almost 4 million jobs involved, okay? Where the government was subsidizing, basically paying 3/4 of the total labor cost. Now, when you think of what that really means, is that it paid most of the wages, because the other costs, like, pension benefits or whatever, contributions and so on, that could also be the, in a sense, would be the other quarter or 20 or whatever percentage. But what's the important point of all this is, again, as it was an attempt to retain workers with the firms. And what this did, of course, think for a moment, our unemployment rate that jumped up. Well, these people that were retained, even though they were in fact unemployed, meaning that they were not working, okay, do not appear in those statistics at all. So it's important to recognize the significance of this effect also in just looking at these figures there, that in fact, Canada would have been impacted a lot more if it wasn't for these changes. Now, in addition to that, they had other kinds of stuff, student, for instance, summer jobs, obviously all these students who could not get these jobs during the summer, they were all getting 1,250 for 16 weeks, during the summer period, okay, until they went back to school, for university students in particular here, okay? Now, there were all kinds of other stuff. I just put some here, like the one-time additional family allowances, benefits, senior citizens, 6 mortgage and rent deferrals. There's all kinds of stuff there. Also, there was the Canada Recovery Benefit. I won't even go on here, but you can see the list here. And I've just highlighted some of the main ones, okay? All of these were introduced during this period here, okay? As I said, I'm not going to go through all of them because it's just too many, but I just wanted to highlight the numbers involved here, okay? That were extensive, okay? Also on the business side, now the only one that one could question in terms of wage subsidy, which is that 3/4 of labor costs that were being paid, okay, as I said, by the government. They also introduced this, what they call the Canada Emergency Business Account, which provided interest-free, partially forgivable, by the way. So if out of 40,000, usually 10,000 was forgiven. So let's say to a restaurant that had to close down, they would advance a loan of 40,000 to maintain them during the initial period. And then you'd have, this kind of forgiven, often about 10,000, okay? Now, depending on the case, they had to make their case here, but this was more direct transfers or advances, to businesses. And also credit availability through various forms here that I won't even go through here right now, okay? Now, what this did, of course, is that these huge deficits, as I said, they're humongous. We haven't seen anything like that, because you're going to see it was quite unprecedented. At best, something comparable happened during the Second World War. Okay. We'd never seen anything like that, certainly since the Second World War. And now, when we look at the actual evolution, okay, of disposable income as against actual national income, there's a huge bifurcation, as we're going to see in a minute on the next slide. But before I get to the next slide, I also want to mention that when we look at the usual mainstream story about deficit spending, that especially in a situation where output is declining in the economy, okay, one would have expected a jump in the inflation rate. Well, as you can see from this graph here, this is the actual level of the CPI, just like the consumer price index. And the consumer price index here, let's say this is in January, this is for 2020. In January, as you can see, was at about 137. Yeah, this was, I think 2002 was the base year, so of 100. But in January, it was 137, let's say was it 0.4 and 4 approximately, whatever, and you can see what happened. It collapsed. You had a significant deflation. And only recently, this is in October, did it get back to the level it was in January, approximately, okay? So the real fears in this country have been deflation and continued deflation because it could impact on wage growth as well in a terrible way, as we're going to see as we get into this. Now, also, and very important, there was an unprecedented bifurcation of the evolution here of the, as I said, the real disposable income and real gross national income. Okay. Normally, I just, again, graphed the data here from 2018, but normally they move in tandem. Obviously, disposable income rises as overall output or income, GDP rises basically in real terms, which is what you're seeing there, more or less. There could be changes in social programs, whatever, you could have transfers there. But what's important here is that what happened in 2020 is incredible, I would argue, amazing, okay? In what sense? And it's traumatic. You see a steep rise in the transfers, okay? And so building up disposable income in this case tremendously, while the real economy was collapsing completely, okay, during that whole period, okay, of the crisis. Okay, so you have a significant change here, as I said, in terms of policy, perspective. Now, if we look at what I call here, I call them the godly equation, but these are just simply the sectoral balances. I've excluded not to jam it up with series in the graph. I've put the three major sectors only. I didn't put the current account balance here, the foreign sector. Okay? Although it's important, but it's not, for our purpose here at least, it's not so quick. And once again, what do we see? We could see here that the government, so this is the government balance, which, as you could see here, was negative, but barely, okay, it wasn't big deficits, okay? Collapsing again here, huge deficits to 20%, approximately, as we were saying, okay? And on the other hand, we look at the business sector now, the corporate sector, it's more or less in balance and a surplus, generally speaking here, okay? And then it just jumps up even more here in terms of, so in other words, for obvious reasons, there is inflow of revenues for the business sector, but it's not investing, and therefore they're increasing their savings, the business savings, if you wish, okay? So it's a net lender, if you want to call it that, in the economy, rather than a net borrower in the case of the government sector here, okay? But what's important is the household sector, okay? The household sector was a net borrower here. In other words, this is a sector where household debt was exploding in Canada, okay? And what we see here is a complete reversal of that, okay? Just skyrocketed again in the positive direction, okay? It became a net lender now, all of a sudden, okay? Actually, it's even more interesting. I took out specifically the savings rate, the household saving rate for Canada. which is very low, okay, as you can see here, historically. For a long while, since the 1990s and so on, it's been very low. And at the same time, of course, you got the government deficit. Well, it's obvious here, okay, that the big jump in the government deficit led to a huge increase in the savings rate to almost 30% from around 2-3%. Okay. So a dramatic change in the savings rate. Now, why? Of course, it's because people find themselves with all these transfers here and they're not spending. Okay, they're not spending. People don't even go out very much. Or you do groceries, and that's what, you know, you don't go for traveling as to Mexico or whatever. Okay. None of that happened anymore. And so what has happened is a huge and dramatic increase in the savings rate, okay, which has led to, interestingly, a decline in household indebtedness here, kind of a positive byproduct of this crisis, so to speak, here for many households, okay? That all of a sudden, indeed, some cases where people that were not even earning $2,000 a month now find themselves with $2,000 a month, you know? And as I said, it led to an important change in behavior once again here, okay? Now, so what we have, you know, is that this huge deficit in spending and the buildup of the public debt compares more, as I said, with the experience that we had during the Second World War, which in the case of Canada and the United States had led to some really important changes also in the behavior of the central bank. Now, I'm going to focus on monetary policy and in particular. And I'm going to ask the question here, as you know, Canada, which at the time, and actually during the global financial crisis of 2008, 2009, did not actually officially implement quantitative easing in particular, QE, okay, did so this time around in this crisis, in big times, okay? And of course, but the question is, what else did it do? And this is where this sort of MMT kind of perspective on this matter has been debated in this country a great deal, actually, to the point, as we're going to see at the end there, where I have a nice speech from the Minister of Finance on this question, where she denies it, but at the same time, I think it's just to, you know, how should I say, mitigate the reactions of the financial markets on this whole issue, because we'll see in a minute, okay? Now, once again, I'm gonna have to focus more on Canada because that's the data that I have available, I must say, okay? But also because there were some really interesting policy innovations here, okay? That really lead one to think that there was some thought to this, that, as I said, the last time around, when we had any kind of innovation of that nature was during the 1930s or during the Second World War again, okay? And ever since then, nothing of this nature ever happened until recently. And I'll explain this in a second. Now, according to the Bank of Canada, in response to the economic impacts stemming from the COVID-19 crisis, the bank, of course, what it did right away was immediately to lower the interbank rate, the overnight rate, as we call it in Canada, to 0.25%, you know, the floor, if you want, of the overnight rate. Now, the reason why it's not lower than that is because we have a corridor system in place that the central bank uses in order to control interest rates. And it targets the overnight rate at the midpoint, but in this case, it let it drop to the bottom because of QE, as we'll see in a minute, okay? But it could only go as far as what it pays on the reserves in the banking system resulting, let's say, from the quantitative easing, okay? Or what we call positive settlement balances in the interbank market in Canada. Or what in the US, I don't know about Mexico, but in the US they call them reserves, okay? Bank reserves. Well, here we call them settlement balances because it's a balance sheet operation, as we'll see in a minute, okay? And they are, could either be negative or positive, obviously, in the interbank market, okay? But in the overall, normally, these settlement balances in Canada are zero. Why? Because we have no reserve requirements. Banks do not hold reserves. And therefore, normally it's close to zero. They're slightly positive, but not very much, as we'll see, okay? In the US, it's not. And I'm not sure about Mexico on this issue, but I could say here that what we have here is a system that all of a sudden went from almost zero, let's say practically zero, to huge numbers, as we're going to get to in a minute, okay? Now, the bank launched, in addition to this sort of, getting interest rates down to the floor, it also launched a range of liquidity facilities and purchases, okay, programs here in place to sustain asset prices. Now, this took several forms of central bank intervention, especially because, of course, with the collapse of asset prices at the beginning of the COVID crisis, as you know, even the stock market collapsed initially. And then with the response, this led to, because of QE, not only did they bring them back up to where they were, but actually jumped to about as much as 20%. So we get into this ironic situation, which one would question in terms of the wealth effects of all this, the redistributed wealth effects of all this. But in an economy that is collapsing, what also sees that there are huge capital gains being made in the stock market, resulting from the activities of the central banks in boosting these asset prices through QE, okay? So these are the kind of, how should I say, more pernicious kind of consequences of this policy. But what's important here, this was followed both in Canada and the United States, okay? I'm not sure about Mexico, what happened. But I could say here that they implemented it big times. And, through this large asset, as I said, large scale asset purchases that increase tremendously the liquidity in the banking and financial system. Okay? Now, what were these programs? I'm just going to give you a list again here, some of the more important ones, okay? And then we'll, but I'll go through these quickly because I know the time is short and I don't want to. But, oh my God, okay. So I have only about, 5-10 minutes or so, okay? Okay, let me just throw quickly now. They introduced a whole bunch of really important bond purchases programs. Also purchases of, mortgage bonds, okay? The usual kind of MBS stuff in the secondary market. Now, I just want to emphasize that quantitative easing has to do with asset purchases, but in the secondary market, okay? Where you got these dealers that have access to the primary markets for government securities. They're able to purchase them, and then they resell them in the secondary market. And here it's the Bank of Canada buying them from the secondary market. Now, lots of examples of that. Obviously, in the US, as we all know, even during the global financial crisis, we saw it in the Eurozone, of course, since 2015, with the ECB buying up again big times, but it's in the secondary market. It's important to understand that. Well, guess what happened? In the case of Canada, it started buying them also in the primary market, okay? Not only of and these are the important innovations, quote unquote, okay? One is buying in the primary market, in other words, directly purchasing from Treasury, if you wish, where they're issuing these bonds, okay? And also from the provincial treasury. So they're also buying up in the primary market for provincial bonds and securities, okay? Going on, okay? They also bought up all kinds of other stuff, commercial paper, corporate bond purchases. But what is important is the direct purchases on the primary market here was very significant, between 10 and 20% normally was the case, but now during the crisis, it jumped to like 40%, and more, okay, until it went back down by August, September, okay? So there was a huge jump in these primary kind of purchases going on. And this is where that whole issue of whether, the government of Canada was in fact practicing modern monetary theory, so to speak, in terms of bond purchases directly on the, on the bond market. Now I won't have time to go through all this, but I wanted to show you here the balance sheets of the Bank of Canada and then of the government as well. I'm going to jump all that, but I'm just going to give you the actual calculations. I don't have time to go through this, okay? But just the calculations here. I have data here for April all the way to June during the thick of the crisis. And what you see here is the proportion of treasury bills that were acquired by the Bank of Canada from the government. No, in this case, issued by the government of Canada. And in April it was 38%, May 50%, June 50% of all the treasury bills. In the case of the federal bonds, it was 100%. It was even 147%. Now why 100? Because they bought also in the secondary market. They were buying them through QE. So that's why there's more than 100% even in this case, or 183%. So they're buying big times here, okay? And obviously this had an impact not only through in the case of the overnight rate shooting down to a quarter, as I said, a quarter of a percentage point, but also all the other bonds here, they all collapsed, as you could see here, to extremely low levels here that we have. Like in the case, this is like less than 0.4%, for these short-term and longer-term ones that are less than 1%, okay? So you have incredible impact here across the whole yield curve, if you wish, the whole spectrum of interest rates in the economy, okay? And now, this has led to this whole debate in Canada as to whether or not we had impacted MMT. But before I say, there's just one last thing, and then I'll get to the last issue about it. These large reserves, of course, are positive settlement balances. There have been many people who have argued that and fearing inflation again. When you look at the numbers, they're astronomical, okay? And again, when we look at the inflation rate, as we saw earlier, was collapsing, okay? So again, all the standard theories, whether it be about deficits causing inflation, about growth in base money causing inflation, about deficits leading to higher interest rates, none of these make any sense in this context. A complete opposite has happened, okay? So anybody who still believes in these mainstream theories should change their textbooks for sure, because there's absolutely no way that you could substantiate this from the evidence that we have, okay? And now, Canada, interestingly enough, and institutionally, in fact, I refer to my colleague Marc Lavoie, because we have both always argued, actually, that Canada, perhaps, as at least at the institutional level, the one that has the closest to what we call the MMT nirvana here in terms of possibilities to implement such policies. Okay? First, the Bank of Canada is not institutionally independent at all, unlike Banco de Mexico and the US Fed. Okay, it's not. Okay, for reasons that I explained there here. In fact, going back to 1961, where there was a crisis over this issue at the time. Okay? Secondly, okay, there is in fact no legal impediments for the Bank of Canada to purchase government securities directly on the primary market, okay? In which, of course, all these bank broker dealers cannot intervene and collect, huge commissions from. As is the case in Mexico and in oops, I kind of said it twice there, United States. Sorry, okay. Where, of course, in the case of Mexico, it's prohibited, okay, and by law, okay, or in the United States where we have debt ceilings here and all this kind of stuff by Congress and so on. Okay, none of this exists in Canada. It's free to do what it wants, literally. Okay, and thirdly, except for a very short period between 1962 and 1970. When we had adopted a fixed exchange rate, actually it wasn't literally fixed, but it was with bands, okay? It was not pegged. Since 1950, Canada has floated its exchange rate internationally. We have a floating exchange rate. In fact, even during the period of Bretton Woods, as I said, in 1950, we were floating. We were not under fixed exchange rate, okay? And we have a pure float. The government, the central bank says it has not intervened since 1998 officially, okay? So we have a pure float right now, which is the ideal case for an MMT kind of policy, if you read the sort of literature on that, okay? Well, given these institutional features, as I said, you could see how this could be interpreted as a kind of pursuit of MMT type policies here. Well, I just have here this in October here, and at the end of October, October 28, our Minister of Finance delivered a speech at the Toronto Global Forum where she refused, of course, to be pinned down as pursuing this kind of MMT policy. And I literally have a long quote from her. Okay? But this is the part where she says, essentially, having said all this, now it has to do with the fact that she's committed to big deficit spending, blah, 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 all the other things there, but is responsible at the same time, quote unquote, according to the financial market interpretation of what is responsible. Having said that, she says here, let me offer this important caveat. While advocating expansive fiscal policy to battle COVID-19 and to grow our economy way out of the coronavirus recession, I am not among those who think that Canada should have a fling with modern monetary theory, which holds that deficits don't matter for a government that issues debt in its own currency. Whether on Bay Street, now Bay Street is like our Wall Street there in terms of Toronto, or Main Street, there are no blank checks and there are no free lunches, blah. So she gives all this nonsense about how, in fact, she kind of caters to that, but in reality, everything they've been doing is perfectly consistent with that, I would argue, okay? And I think it has more to do to kind of appease those who are critics, especially on the conservative side here, because we have a minority government also, and there's a lot of political, kind of maneuvering going on. And if they're accused of something that is deemed as irresponsible fiscal policy, this is, but it's interesting, I must say, now they're starting to criticize the government, but during the crisis, especially during April, May, and so on, when, in the thick of the crisis, there was an incredible unity, political unity among our political elites over the necessity to implement these policies. So it's kind of interesting. Now it's kind of, that consensus is breaking up, okay? And you're starting to see them attack, especially when they looked at those statistics, when they compared to other countries, how Canada's just gone way out there, on the limb on that. Anyways, I'll stop there and allow Wesley to to come into the picture here. and I'll be happy to take all questions.
Thank you very much for your participation, Dr. Seccareccia. Now we will give we give place to Wesley Marshall. Marshall, tienes alrededor de 10 o 15 minutos para comentar al doctor Seccareccia y después de esto haremos la recolección de preguntas y respuestas. Gracias. After Marshall intervention, we will pick up some questions so you can answer them. Thank you.
Yes. So,
Wes, ¿andas por ahí? Sí, muy bien.
Sí, perdón, ¿me escuchas?
Sí, sí te escuchamos bien.
¿Inglés o español?
Quisiéramos, si puedes hacerlo en español, no sé si, well,
Tú escoges.
porque la audiencia está en español, sería
Wow,
bueno,
sí,
y si
sí.
hay que hacer algo, alguna puntualización al doctor directo, pues se lo haces en inglés, ¿va?
it's fine with me if you go
All
there
right.
and do it in Spanish. I mean, it's fine with me. Although I should say to you right now that I will not answer anything that he asks. I'm teasing. No, go ahead.
Buenas tardes a todos. Un gusto ver a todos. Hola, Mario. Yo no creo tomar 15 minutos. Voy a ser un poco más breve y nada más quiero reaccionar a algunos de los puntos del doctor Seccareccia. Primero, siempre es muy interesante escuchar el punto de vista canadiense cuando realmente en todo periodo histórico tenemos cosas muy diferentes que nos pueden servir de contrastes con las experiencias de políticas públicas que tenemos. Tenemos, desde que yo empecé a aprender cosas sobre el sistema monetario canadiense, tenemos que no hay reservas, que acabo de mencionar el doctor, muy importante. No hubo crisis bancaria en 2008 y 2009, bastante interesante. Luego, ahora esta exposición de la nirvana del MMT es bastante interesante también. Las características institucionales que hay en Canadá que podrían permitir la instrumentación mucho más ágil de un sistema así que en otros países, y parece que vamos hacia esa dirección. Si queremos regresar a la historia, el Banco Central de Canadá en la Gran Depresión, muy interesante también. También es interesante cuando estamos hablando de la pandemia para ver la diferencia en respuestas. Hay un virus que no tiene fronteras, no tiene política, pero la reacción a cada país es muy diferente. Y como podemos ver, todos vamos a sufrir consecuencias, pero las consecuencias que vamos a sufrir en México son mucho más graves y se debe a la respuesta económica que no tiene que darse. Hay que matizar mucho. No es lo mismo estar en el Banco Central en Canadá que en México. Son posiciones en el mundo muy diferentes. Hay que matizar, pero es importante resaltar que hay mucho margen de maniobra y se puede hacer las cosas de forma muy diferente. El doctor menciona, eso sí no fue algo para mí tan novedoso, yo creo que para muchos. Hay un montón de nueva deuda. Yo creo que todos sabemos eso, escuchamos al presidente, no nos vamos a endeudar. Claro, nos vamos a endeudar, pero no tanto como otros países. ¿Qué va a pasar con esa deuda? Y tenemos otra experiencia canadiense interesante ahí. que la última vez que el Fondo Monetario y el Banco Mundial y otros, bueno, esos dos, andaban diciendo que necesitamos una expansión fiscal, que por favor todos tenemos que endeudarnos, fue en 2009. En 2010, en Toronto, en la reunión del G20, dijeron, ahora es momento de pagar, vamos a la austeridad. Yo pienso, quién sabe, yo pienso, van a cobrar la factura tarde o temprano. Es lo que siempre hacen. Entonces es un punto interesante cuándo vamos a tener que pagar todo eso enorme endeudamiento y cómo. Y nada más quiero comentar una última parte que me pareció muy interesante. Cuando hacia el final el doctor nos dice, la teoría estándar no sirve para nada en esas aguas desconocidas. Pero como él ha estado argumentando desde hace décadas, nunca ha servido. Es muy evidente ahora, pero nunca ha servido. Y tomamos unas cosas. ¿Quiénes son los que fueron el gran apoyo académico del viraje del Fondo Monetario hacia la austeridad en 2010 en el G20? Fue Carmen Reinhardt y Kenneth Rogoff. Ellos, con su gran hipótesis que hay un umbral de endeudamiento de 90% del PIB antes de irnos a la crisis macroeconómica, que posteriormente un alumno en la Universidad de Massachusetts, al exigir sus datos, se da cuenta que no están haciendo un estudio en serio, están solamente usando los datos que les sirven. Pero no importaba. En todo caso, vamos a la austeridad. Hace unos días el mismo señor Rogoff tiene un artículo interesante diciendo ahora no hay volatilidad cambiaria. En México, ningún país hemos visto crisis de cambio. Pero, bueno, no tenemos crisis de cambio. Como el doctor dice, ningún problema de inflación, ningún problema de sobreendeudamiento. En cualquier otro momento, si vemos los variables macroeconómicos cambiar como han cambiado, hay crisis en todo el mundo. ¿Por qué no hay crisis en todo el mundo ahora? Pregunta interesante. Digo, porque no es mío, muchos lo preguntan. Entonces, estamos en un momento bastante curioso y el último punto sobre inflación o deflación. El Martin Wolf del Financial Times, un barómetro interesante para ver qué están pensando desde arriba, hace 2 días también saca su nota que vamos a regresar a la inflación. Desde hace ya casi una década, todos están diciendo, necesitamos inflación. ¿Cómo vamos a poder regresar la inflación? Pero como el doctor nos enseña, vamos cada vez más hacia la deflación. Cada vez que intentan más, según ellos, ir hacia la inflación, es nada más deflación. Pero obviamente no están usando todas las herramientas. Esas fueron mis reflexiones sobre la participación del doctor Seccareccia. Quiero agradecerle mucho, fue una plática muy interesante, aprendí varias cosas nuevas y como siempre tener la visión global del doctor es muy enriquecedor para mí y espero que para todo el público. Y ahí lo dejo. Muchas gracias a todos.
Muchas gracias. Well, could I just, am I allowed to comment on one thing or should I?
Well, we have around 40 minutes, 42 minutes. So if you want to take 5-10 minutes to,
Well, just a few
reply.
minutes. I mean, just to respond to one of them.
Yes, just to reply. And after, we are going to collect some questions from the public. All right, go ahead.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much. And thank you very much, Wesley, for your comments. I appreciate them very much. I should say that I liked especially your comparison with what happened immediately following the global financial crisis. And then, as you said, in Toronto in 2010, there was a complete reversal of the policies of, back austerity, whatever, Mark II, and so on, okay? So, and will this be, again, another round of this? Absolutely, I think this is gonna happen again, and are they gonna try? See, what has happened already, and we're seeing it in Canada here, big time, so, as I said, what was remarkable initially was a sense of unity, of purpose. No, here at least there was, not in the United States where they've been bickering forever, and it's like the Titanic that's, they're fighting there as the whole ship sinks, as we could see even now there. Okay, here there was a sense of purpose initially. Okay, and even the conservatives, even the diehard ones, really, either they shut their trap because politically they would be eaten alive almost, or, as I said, they actually agreed in a sense, okay? And so when the ship is sinking, so to speak, everybody believed in building lifeboats, if you wish, and did so, okay? But once you're in the high sea now, there's gonna start to be bickering here over which way to go, as you could imagine, okay? And which direction. And what has happened, of course, over the last couple of months at least, okay, until the summer, I would argue, things were solidaristic when it came to this issue.
Lo perdimos.
Lo perdimos.
But now there's all kinds of facts. And the really was by the government, okay, and is stay here. And then the question is, was this debt ratios that we faced during the Second World War, by the way? And at the time, nobody, even after the war, ever questioned that the high deficit, or debt rather, ratios at the time, to be of importance to address, because they disappeared on their own. Once we recovered growth after the Second World War, okay, those debt ratios declined dramatically throughout the first 2 decades of the post-war period. However, when they started to become a problem, actually, ironically, is when they started to implement anti-inflationary policies with high interest rates that slowed down the economy, raised the servicing of the debt and everything else. And that's how they exploded, by the way, historically, okay? Except during recession period, where you're going to have a bigger debt, appearing as a result of, the response of the state here. But if they're able to return to some kind of recovery phase, then the question is that much of this kind of fighting may settle down. But will it happen? My fear is, no, it's not going to happen anytime soon. I mean, given the situation right now, is that we're going to have this coronavirus, around for a while. Okay, surely over the next couple of years, we're still going to be living with this thing. Okay, and what I would like to think is that at some point, there, these sort of chicken as they come home to roost here, it's going to end up leading to a lot of fighting over this and a reversal. And even the Minister of Finance, who's actually one of the more progressive, really, compared to some of the others that we've had, the last minister, who was really fairly right-wing, she's a very progressive kind of person, relatively speaking. and one who I think is interested in more innovative and thinking outside of the box, if you wish, kind of person. But even she is preparing the terrain, as she said herself. No, we want to, but we believe in, in fiscal sound finance, the usual kind of stories. Yeah. Anyways, just to say, yes, that's the big problem I had. And heaven knows, I mean, I don't have any crystal ball there, but my fear is that I think we're going to be hit in big times with that one.
Okay, since I have the microphone, I will take advantage of it. I have a couple of questions for Dr. Seccareccia. You said that the deficit was helping households to save. Since I have been following your work, you argue in some papers that indebtedness in households in Canada was increasing, especially in mortgage, in the mortgage sector. So how this moment, or how this situation is helping or worsening the situation for households? I mean, this is just a period of time where they are getting relief, or it's going to continue some policies for helping indebtedness for households, as well as corporations, but because corporations are really in debt also. So how deficit is helping them to improve their situation?
Okay, could I just say, just from the figures, that the graphs that I had shown earlier there, okay, globally, okay, what we have is both the household sector and the business sector finding themselves in a growing surplus situation. Now, that's obvious when the government sector is running a deficit. I mean, they are mirrors of each other, okay? So here's a case where the business sector as a whole, and I emphasize that because that's the problem, okay, is that when you disaggregate it, you get into a different story, okay? As a whole, what we have is the business sector doing relatively well globally, okay? In fact, as I said, they're reducing their debt ratios, comparatively speaking. Same thing for the household sector. But in fact, in the household sector, it's a bit bizarre what's going on here, because in the midst of a pandemic, we have a housing bubble almost still going on. And this is being fed by two things here. One is the epidemic itself, where people are trying to leave their apartment if you're renting, for instance, because now you could go outside of the city and still work. You could work for, like, from the university, for example. You could work, even if you're in Mexico, you could still teach. Okay. But you're going outside of the cities in this case. And so there's a lot of buying going on. Okay. So there's a kind of revamping, whatever you want to call it, of the way in which the housing sector is expanding. So the debt ratios are not falling as much as they should, just from the fact that you have this huge savings rate. Because what's going on here is that a lot of this kind of liquidity of the housing sector, the household sector, is actually now spurring on growing indebtedness to borrow, to buy at these incredibly low interest rates here. We have interest rates less than 2% on mortgages for 5-10 years. So with that kind of situation, people are jumping onto that, okay? And secondly, of course, as I said, you have the fact that, so you got, on the one hand, higher savings, but on the other hand, it's also stimulating certain kind of activities. Now, as I said, this is the aggregate. This is not true both for businesses and for households at the individual level, if you want to call it, because as you know perfectly well, if you've read any, like for instance, the paper that I did with Ursula in the Journal of Economic Issues from this year, okay? Well, that one, if you look at the figures, we showed how, in fact, you have at the very low end of the income distribution, the savings rates are, are not as strong. Now, unfortunately, it's annual data. By the way, I looked for it because I was looking to see what was happening there. Unfortunately, the data is an annual data available. So we will only know by next year what happened this year, okay, in terms of the distribution of the savings rates by income categories, okay? But if I had to imagine more or less what's going on, it is clear that if you were at the bottom end of the income scale, okay, you're not going to be facing, in other words, your savings rate is going to be very low. But you know, because of these payments that went almost across the board to people, okay, it's actually, I think it has probably reduced the income distribution, okay, somewhat over the last 6 months, has narrowed it, and some of that has trickled down to the level of the low income categories, okay, of the first quintile, at the bottom quintiles. So that what I'm getting at is that hunch is that that this is true for across the board, but less so at the bottom for sure. Okay, because the ones who are the wealthiest are the ones who, you know, were the ones who would go off and travel or something, but they're now not spending any of that. They don't go on cruises and anything, you know. I'm just, you know, being facetious here, but to say that it wasn't the people at the bottom there that would go on the cruise ships, okay? And therefore, what I'm getting at is here that this has, I think it has, you know, led to increases in the savings rate, primarily on the upper hand, less on the bottom end, but I think it has in fact reduced that weight of the debt, okay, that existed before. But as I said, I don't have the data to show it, okay? We don't have that information yet. It's too early in the game. But that's my feeling about that. And the same thing for the businesses. Obviously, there are sectors of the economy that just went on, you know, retail, like for instance, groceries, they are booming. They're doing super well. Very huge profits there, okay? But there are other sectors, but the restaurants, as an example, they've collapsed almost, you know, because, you know, people don't go or they have to restrict them altogether. So what has happened there is that you've seen kind of, again, a widening. Okay? Those on the bottom end here again, they are getting all these credits, advances from the state. Okay, even with some of the stuff, remember they were getting, let's say for a small and business, medium-sized business, they could get up to 40,000 of advances. Okay, well, which isn't much if, you know, if you're dealing with annual revenues, let's say, that have collapsed, you know, to half of what they may have been. But, you know, there's been that. And as I said, the government has, you know, allowed some of that to be a grant, if you wish, a direct transfer, but only about a quarter of it. So you're not talking about much. And if you're a small business, you're in trouble. Okay, here, and they're all crying about it because they don't want, they just want things to really open up, you know, in a way that, you know, that's not happening right now because we've seen a second wave of it. And it's happening here just like it's happening in the United States right now and probably in Mexico as well at this point. Okay, so there's a lot of debate exactly over that. Okay, because those businesses that are hurting are at the low end, but the big ones, okay, except for the you know, as I said, the air carrier, like, you know, Air Canada, for instance, all these, the really important businesses, especially in, as I said, in certain sectors, you know, in the food and processing and all that, they've been doing extremely well. Okay, their profitability has risen, has not fallen. Okay. So this is why, and this is in part through the support from these deficits, again, these deficit spending. I mean, it's just building up profits, but it's very unequal. Mm-hmm. Okay. And it's also, as I said, it's going to a lot of these households, but it's more equal there than in the business sector. I would say the transfers through these deficit spending.
Thank you very much. Dr. Monica Meireles thanks both of you for your participation, and she has a question for both of you. So what are the political change that this situation may lead? I mean, do you consider there is any political change in, that is result from this situation, that results from this situation? Both of you.
Oh God, I don't know if Wesley wants to go ahead or.
I'm happy to go ahead to give you a minute to think.
Sure. Thank you.
No problem. It's a great question. And I know we have some important elections coming up in South America this year. My guess, well, who knows? In South America, it looks interesting, but I would think in Europe, North America, I don't see that this would have any real political effect. So sorry if that's not too much time to let you think, Mario.
I was praying that I could. Yeah.
We have time.
No, I'm happy to answer this. I mean, I don't have a simple answer, obviously. I mean, I don't have certainly I don't have a crystal ball here to know what's going to happen. But what I could say, honestly, is that I think there has been a bit of a game change for one thing only, okay, which is that on the issue of the possibilities of pursuing policies right now, outside of the box, have, to some extent, have become a little more legitimized, okay? Not completely. I mean, we still, as I was saying earlier there, you know, our conservatives in our opposition, they're attacking the government for running big deficits. But they're careful not to be too vocal about it too. Because obviously they're all feeding on it, okay? And some of their own constituents don't want, you know, like the business sector doesn't want a deficit to go down the tubes here, and because it will mean real problems for these companies as well. But what it has done, I think it has opened up, like, to some extent. Now, I only say to some extent because we're in a completely different world than it was right after the Second World War. Completely different world, okay? But at least on this issue of the policy discourse, it has opened up and legitimized policies that until the first crisis, that is the global financial crisis 10 years ago, also they kind of budged a little bit on that. If you recall then, during the crisis, all of them were pushing for fiscal deficits, you know, et cetera, et cetera. But as you said, as Wesley said, by what, 2010, barely 2 years later, not even, okay, they reversed it. And we got back to this kind of world where, once again, as if nothing had happened, we kind of bridged, we jumped the global financial crisis and stuck to the same kind of policy orientation or views, okay? But this one is a bigger one. It's a big one, in fact, okay? And what we've seen is, I think, a certain degree of legitimization of policies that until recently were, you know, not deemed acceptable, you know? So will that stick as it did initially after the Second World War? I don't know, okay? But I like to think that it's in the realm of the possible because of this, because of the gravity of this whole thing, okay? Nobody here, even the most conservative, would say that we should not be spending more in the epidemic, okay? And so that's something which I think it's hard for them to kind of completely backtrack on, okay? So I don't, as I said, I don't know what will happen, but I'm perhaps I'm a little bit more optimistic on that front. But that's the only, as far as it goes, you know, because honestly, I mean, the forces here haven't changed. The social forces at work that are influencing all this haven't changed much, but the political discourse has. So who knows?
Thank you. We have a couple of questions. One of our students asked if there is a bigger indebtedness is there any possibility to be in the Ponzi position? I mean, in countries like Mexico or any other position that just runs bigger fiscal deficit could have a position of Ponzi position, a position of Ponzi.
Okay, Ponzi. Okay, I could say to you right away, okay, that we faced a Ponzi position even here. By the way, during the 1980s in Canada, we were running huge deficits at the time because of high interest rates, basically, because of high servicing of the debt. I mean, if you have interest rates going up, well, Mexico, God forbid, yours are like way through the stratosphere in the 80s. But in Canada, we had hit, just like after the Volcker shock there in the early 1980s, we had hit interest rates in the order of 20% for those treasury bills, for instance, okay? 20% even in 1981, okay? So obviously this impacts directly on the servicing of the debt. And what we were having, however, is that during that whole period, we were facing huge deficits, but also big primary surpluses because of the fact that it was all interest payments that were feeding it. So it's like the government borrowing to pay interest. Now, this is not new. We saw that with Greece, in the Eurozone. Lots of examples of that, okay? However, okay, what's important is that a country like ours, a sovereign country that has its own currency, again, this is the kind of MMT story, I would say, that I completely buy, is that it can, in fact, pay for that, okay? It's not a captive to the financial markets. The Eurozone, so Greece is, but certain countries like Mexico, for instance, would not necessarily be, unless you accept certain things. Now, what do you accept? I know that in Latin America in particular, there's a huge difference between, certain countries there and, let's say, Canada here, where our debt is, first of all, even if we have borrowed abroad, which is very, very, very low, by the way, okay, maybe around 5%, it is almost all of it is denominated in Canadian dollars, because we have a currency here that actually with the G7 somehow has a market for it out there. And therefore is in that hierarchy of currencies relative to, let's say, to certain other countries, which have, been able to have that. Now, in the case of countries that have borrowed in a currency other than their own, then you could get, you got big problems there. And that forces you into a situation of having a kind of fixed exchange rate regime, because if you don't do that, you could end up going belly up, basically, okay? You could become insolvent. And this is where the problem arises. And this is where, as I was saying, is that if you're in that kind of trap, it's a different story. And therefore, you could end up in a Ponzi situation if interest rates start to rise again because they're fighting inflation or God knows what. But I don't see any of that in the horizon over the next while. That's the thing I like to think I'm almost sure about. Maybe God knows I am wrong. But I really don't see inflation. As I said, the real danger is not inflation, it's deflation. Therefore, you're not going to see interest rates going up very much, because if they will, it will be a catastrophe, okay? And so I don't see that happening, okay? So that's why I'm saying this kind of Ponzi story, it requires that interest rates are rising in such a way that you can't even keep up there. You got to borrow just to pay the interest on that public debt. But that's not the case. I don't see anything like that happening in the next years even. Okay? I don't see that right now. That's the difference. I'm not sure if I answered that correctly, but that is what I understand of this right now.
Okay, we have another question from Guillermo Rufo. He thanked you for the conference. And what are the prospects for Canada in terms of the impact of pandemic on the composition of job and business? Do you see a permanent structural change in Canada from now on?
Oh boy, that's well, it has changed already, I would say. You know, I mean, there are certain things that have been changing very quickly. I mean, and remember I said this are booming and others are in a Great Depression. Okay. Now, the industries that are booming, like, friends, all the carrying kind of trade part there, you know, like Amazon or the Canadian equivalents of some of those, all the stuff where you buy anything online, this thing is booming right now, okay? And especially during, as we're getting close to Christmas and all that, it's going to be interesting to see how this is going to happen. But my point here is that it depends on the sectors that are technologically able to deal with this, which, as I said, is not a short-term affair. I mean, the fact that we're going to be buying more online, as an example, rather than going into a shopping center and buying stuff, I think this is changing already, and it's going to be dramatic. And I have a feeling that within the next, and it's not reversible, you know, so in the next few years, it's not as if we're going to go back to the shopping centers in the same way, okay? So some of the more traditional industries are going to be changing here, for sure, as a result, not just of technological change here, which is obvious here, but the mere fact that because of necessity in some cases, there has been changes. And even in certain areas like education, I mean, all of us know, will they still even need us? I mean, there's another issue, okay? Will you still be employed? You know, I mean, I'm being very honest about this because, in fact, we could see here by the mere fact that we're able to do it via Zoom, all this, okay, means that they will try to introduce these new technologies so that it could, in fact, further enhance. And they've had the experience now by force, almost, you know, to do this. So all I could say here is that, as I said, again, I don't have a crystal ball, but what we do see is a realignment in terms of the industrial structures, okay? So the traditional manufacturing, again, that has been hit badly, and it's just going to continue. So in the case of, in fact, most more industrial countries like Canada, the United States, those sectors are going to be hit, you know, they have been hit and they're going to continue to decline. But what in the services category, as I said, that's the one that I think we're seeing a really important realignment going on here, okay? In both in terms of producers kind of services like transport, you know, as I said, like the Amazon example and all that, versus the personal kind of services, which again, I think there's going to be serious realignment there. Okay. Are we going to still continue to go to the theater? Are you going to go to the hairdresser the same way as before? There's all these kind of changes that I think have been happening during the crisis, and some of these are not reversible. Maybe you'll still go back to your hairdresser, but you may not go to the theater anymore because you're going to do it on Netflix now. You're used to that, and it's going to stay on like that. You know, there's a lot of things going on at that level in the service sector, which I think are going to be they're dramatic. And we're going to see the outcome of this in the next few years, not in the next decade even, or next 2 decades, in the next few years. It's short because they have been important changes already. They shook up the system.
But in terms of jobs and employment, what are the changes? I mean, this this desire to implement full employment policies right now, how long can last with these changes going on?
Well, yeah, in terms of full employment policy, well, it's very interesting. You know, if they want these changes, you know, the good thing about this country compared to the United States, I don't know about Mexico exactly in the details of this, but I think it's more like the United States, is that we have still an important trade union sector. You know, in certain sectors of the economy, there's fairly important unionization going on, you know, that have retained that position despite the crisis right now. Okay, now why is all of that important? Well, it's because they need to have a support system in place to manage these technological changes in order to be able to get people to adapt and change, not having a fight all the time over it. And to do that, you must have, one, a full employment policy together with a social safety net here that is significant. If you have those, you could get cooperative relations in terms of the adapting of technological change to whatever it might be in firms and so on. If you don't have that, you're going to get resistance to that. It will lead to all kinds of strife. We've seen that in the automobile sector, by the way. Okay, it's interesting, in the automobile sector, they've negotiated a deal. This is the fact that Canada has lost a lot, actually, relative to Mexico, that has gained, because of the North American industry has been kind of reshuffling on the continent. But just recently, about a month ago, if I remember correctly, they negotiated a deal for, again, to have a whole new plant, just building, let's say in this case, electrical kind of, cars that would be, so that they're focusing exclusively on certain kind of activities. But this was done through the negotiations, again, with the unions, okay? And it would have been difficult without them, okay? And so I'm just saying is that there has been some revamping going on here, but if you want to be able to maintain yourself aloof in this kind of world of competitive changes in technology going on, okay? And at the same, well, you have to have a commitment that people are not going to be unemployed as a result of it. There will not be Luddites kind of reaction to this, okay, in the case of, what is happening. And the best way is to have a policy that is committed to that. Now, what does that mean? Well, we could debate whether it should be like an ELR or whatever, okay? But there are needs here to be met, okay? That can only be met politically if the commitment to both high employment or full employment, so that you do not lose jobs in the process of change. And secondly, of course, that there's a significant social safety net, so that if you do, in fact, lose the job, you will still have income. And we saw that if they could do it during the crisis right now, they could certainly do it for the future if they want. Okay, so I see it in a kind of positive light, this. But not in all countries, and this is the problem. It's the social forces at work here, okay? And in some cases, it's going to be more difficult to do that, okay? But in this country, I think there's a better balance of forces, both the United States and Mexico, I would say, when it comes to, to working people, relatively speaking.
Sorry, I don't see any more questions, but if Monica has another question, she can have the time. Otherwise, you can close it with a couple of 2 minutes comments, both of you, so go ahead.
I don't know if, would you like me to start?
Anything else?
Oh, okay, I'll wait for the questions if there are any questions.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, Wes, do you have any other comment to add?
It was great to see everyone. Un gusto ver a todos. Muchas gracias.
Please.
Yes, it's been a pleasure to actually to see you. Some of you I've known, like Claudia, of course. Monica, I don't think we met actually physically before, but I can't remember, but for sure, it's a great pleasure to make your acquaintances, to meet all of you. And I'm extremely delighted to have been invited. I should also say that, and I don't want to sound very optimistic, because Wesley's there to really make sure that I will not be, but I'm being, but I think this crisis, no matter how bad it has been, this is a terrible thing that has happened. Okay? There's no question of it, in terms of its magnitude, in terms of how it permeated the worst part of our lives, literally. This is, I mean, even more than a kind of physical kind of problem in terms of jobs and everything else, it has affected us psychologically, that only wars almost are as close as they could get to this kind of problems that we've been facing here, because we've been all imprisoned in our little lives here without any opportunity to, you know, to be able to get out of this box. But at the same time, I think it has also opened up that box. And this is what I'm saying here. You know, it really has opened up the box. There have been important developments, not just, not in theory, you know, in terms of all this stuff, you know, I mean, yeah, it's not like it's like, you know, remember in the 1930s, you had Keynes or whatever, you know, you had certain changes going on there that really impacted. In this case, it's not maybe of that nature, but what it has had is a real kind of opening up. I mean, I never imagined, honestly, a year ago, if you would have told me that we would have acted the way we did here, at least in this country, that until then, nobody would dare defend the idea that we should have not just, you know, we had a small deficit then. Just think of the difference. We had a deficit of, federal deficit was not even $30 billion, okay? Which is very little, maybe whatever it was, 2% of GDP and so on. Well, think for a moment. We've gone up to $350 billion or something in that nature, you know. It's just multiplied by God knows how many fold, okay? And all of this, the sky didn't fall. Nobody initially was complaining about it even, okay? Now they're starting to, you know, to kind of build up some of their arguments against that budget, but they're having a hard time with that. So all I'm getting at is that there have been really important changes, innovations in policy that are going to filter into also the theories and the way in which we frame these policies, okay? That is important because what some of us who, well, I've retired now, but those who are still teaching, even the mainstream will not be able to continue to defend that, the stuff that I think it would look ridiculous if they will say that deficits are inflationary, that, you know, interest rates go up as a result of that, that increases in base money lead to all all of these things that I was showing to be the complete opposite. It's really difficult. We knew it before. Those who were not in the mainstream knew about this before. And it's no surprise to me, but it is a surprise to a lot of people. And therefore, as I said, that's the kind of guarded optimism that I have, because I think there is a change in the way, the outlook and the way in which policymakers are seeing things right now. Even a creep like Donald Trump there that I have very little sympathy for, did kind of open up that Pandora's box. For instance, on the question of trade is a good example. Okay. And there have been a lot of things that have gone on over the last while that I think are pushing people to go outside of the usual box that neoliberalism had established for decades. So that's, I think that's one of the important changes that we should look forward to. But otherwise, let's hope we get out of this mess soon. Okay?
Yes. Well, we thank you both for this conference. It was very interesting and insight. So we close and we want to, queremos darles las gracias por haber participado en esta conferencia magistral. Nos dio mucha entendimiento de lo que está sucediendo y hacia dónde podría caminar la situación de la economía mundial. Esperamos volverlo a tener. We want to have you again next year, probably.
Why not? As long as you're still here. If you survive this mess.
Pero los invitamos al resto de la audiencia a continuar con nosotros en la próxima mesa de 4 a 6, ¿verdad, Moni? De 4 a 6, no, de 2 a 4, todavía tenemos una, de 2 a 4. Muy bien. Entonces, sigan con nosotros. Thank you very much. We are very pleased to have you both here.
Thank you, and muchas gracias, and all the best to everyone there. It was a great pleasure to see you all. Thank you so much. And I hope to see you in person again one of these years.
Yes.
I don't know when.
Yes, thank you.
Okay. Un grande abrazo.
Igual, un abrazo.
Thank you. Thank you. Okay, bye.
Bye.
Chao.
Chao.
Hola, José Carlos.